This is the portrait of the Carpenter family. Over a century, their triumphs and tragedies, secrets and scandals would change that picture forever. Last week, Margaret's life was shattered when a hospital mix-up meant she took home the wrong baby.
I couldn't hurt the child, but she wasn't mine.
Joyce's husband, Arthur, brought another woman home for the night.
She slept one side over and I slept on the other. That was it. 3 in the bed.
And Sheila rebelled against her mother and married her wartime sweetheart, Peter.
In the end, she said, well, I'm going to the pictures on the day you're married. I'm not coming to the wedding. And she didn't.
At the end of World War II, 4 million servicemen came home. They were war heroes, and their wives and girlfriends were expected to treat them as such.
There are no medals for the housewife. For her, it's the greatest day of all. Her man is coming home.
Britain's ports and stations were the scene of many a romantic reunion. But amidst the celebrations, some couples found they had grown apart during the long years of the war.
It was very peculiar, because we were complete strangers to one another. After all that time away, and I think we shook hands, and I think that was it.
Like many other women, Margaret found it hard having her husband Charles back home.
Charles was a major, and he'd been used to army life in India, where he was waited on hand and foot. And if he treated me like an army orderly, I was very sharp with him. I didn't exactly let him know who was boss, but I did let him know I was not going to be bossed. I was not going to be treated like an Indian servant.
Margaret had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. After 6 years on their own, she and the children were now expected to let Charles rule the roost again.
She had to ask for every postage stamp, every piece of paper if she wanted to write a letter, and she found this somewhat demeaning.
Mum really did have to ask Dad for any money that she wanted. She really was dependent on Dad.
And he ordered the kids about, and they weren't used to it, so they didn't like it.
I do remember being cheeky to my father, putting my tongue out at him, and getting a smack bottom. And this amazed me because we'd never been smacked before, and that was a big shock.
But Charles's homecoming had its advantages. He soon landed a job as a county education officer in Cumberland, earning £800 a year with a car thrown in. Margaret could now stop being a servant to her husband and get one of her own. Her standards were exacting.
I had these girls and trained them in housework, and some of them were very ignorant. I remember saying to one when she first came, "Could you bring me a cup of tea?" And that's what she brought me, a cup of tea. No saucer, no spoon, no tray, no anything. She was so ignorant. So I had to start from scratch with a lot of them.
Margaret was the eldest of 12. While she could afford the luxury of domestic help, others in the family had not fared as well. Margaret's younger sister Joyce had to go out to clean for other people. Her husband Arthur was working class, but often out of work.
None of the jobs that Arthur got the money wasn't very good at all. It was one hell of a struggle. Very often I couldn't pay the rent man. I used to tell the kids to be quiet, just go upstairs in the bedroom out the way till they're gone.
Joyce and Arthur lived on these Nottingham streets in a 2 up, 2 down with no bathroom. Once a week, their son Richard would visit the local swimming pool, where private baths cost 2p a time.
They were very strict about how long you could stop in there, because very often there was people in the waiting room. So when your 15 minutes was up, the lady attendant would be banging on the door, ready for you to come out so she could get in, clean the bath for the next person.
The family may have been hard up, but there was one financial sacrifice Joyce's husband Arthur was not prepared to make.
Like most men, Arthur did like his drink, particularly bitter. That was his favourite.
And beer wasn't the only thing Arthur enjoyed in the pub.
Arthur's always been one for the ladies, but when he'd had a drink, he'd go and make fuss of me, even kiss them. Quite passionate, actually, sometimes. It's something that I got used to. It's only occasionally that he went astray. But generally, he was a home-loving man, and he did mean a lot to me. An awful lot.
It wasn't just money and class that separated Joyce from her elder sister. While Joyce had left school at 14, Margaret had been to grammar school and was well read. By 1945, Margaret was in correspondence with the great playwright George Bernard Shaw. The gulf between the two sisters had never been wider.
I don't know whether she knows who Bernard Shaw is, or was. And the fact that he and I wrote to one another wouldn't mean a thing to her. I might just as well have been writing to the fish and chip shop man.
Margaret had managed to hook one of the most flamboyant literary figures of her time with some acute observations on the English language.
I'd been reading something or other that had aroused my argumentative side, and it was by George Bernard Shaw, so I decided to write and tick him off about it. And I did. And he wrote back. And I wrote back. And he wrote again. Yes. And we both enjoyed it. He was a lonely old man after his wife died. So this cheeky young woman writing these letters must have helped him a bit.
Shaw was in his 80s when the correspondence began, but his letters to Margaret soon became downright flirtatious. When she sent him a photo of herself, he wrote,
"As I guessed, a joyous creature, a charmer. You are what experienced men call a dangerous woman."
Margaret's husband was jealous.
Charles was very snooty about him, and he called Shaw old bug whiskers.
Somebody called it a literary love affair. I think that Dad resented this relationship, this literary relationship with someone else.
Matters came to a head when Margaret demanded 2 hours each night away from Charles and the family so she could read and write to Shaw.
Charles took it personally. He didn't understand what it was like to be at the beck and call of a family all the time, like somebody's little dog. I mean, I wanted the same rights as a man has.
It was a fight for her. She won. She won in the end. She always did.
Back in Nottingham, Joyce and Arthur's financial situation was made worse by the fact that their family kept on growing. In the 1940s, it was still considered improper for married couples to use contraception.
French letters, that's what they called them in those days, French letters, but I didn't like it, so we didn't bother, not that way. That's why I had 5 kids.
And baby number 5 was a child they could ill afford. Arthur decided it was time to make the ultimate sacrifice.
He did say afterwards, no more. So it used to get in bed with his back to me. I got used to it. He was right, because he didn't want any more anyway. We couldn't afford it. But it didn't make any difference. He still loved me.
Sheila was one of the youngest Carpenter sisters. She'd made a better marriage than Joyce and lived a comfortable life in Leicester. Sheila's husband Peter was a teacher.
In the early days, I was very conscious of class distinction. My sister Joyce lived in a terraced house in Nottingham, and I always felt a little sorry for her because it was the type of house where you stepped into a front room, which was very, very small, whereas I was fortunate enough to live in a semi-detached, of a good class, if I'm allowed to use that word nowadays.
But Sheila had problems of her own. She was beginning to see why her mother had warned her against marrying Peter. Despite having 3 children around, she felt isolated and lonely.
Peter was obsessively quiet. He was quite content to come home and not talk at all, and I found a great need to exercise my tongue. So I can even remember keeping the milkman waiting on the doorstep while I chatted about anything, just to be able to talk to another human being. It was not what I thought marriage would be.
Sheila got a job to escape her boredom. In the 1950s, 1 in 5 married women were working, but they were still financially dependent on their husbands, and any money they did earn often wasn't theirs to keep.
It never even occurred to me that I wouldn't have to hand my wage packet over to Peter when I first went out to work. If there was something I needed urgently, for example, sanitary towels, then I had to go cap in hand and say, please, may I have ½ a crown because I need to buy some. Peter was always in charge, so to speak, and I just followed. Perhaps I remember my marriage vows when I promised to obey.
In comparison to her sisters' lives, Margaret seemed to have it all. But life in the Wheeler household was not quite as it seemed. There was a secret attached to Margaret's elder daughter, Val, a secret that had tormented her ever since the little girl was born. Margaret was convinced that Val was not her daughter, that she had been accidentally swapped at birth, and that another woman was bringing up her real child.
I never felt that Val was my child. She was a child I had come by accident. She was part of my family. I had to bring her up and look after her, take care of her, make sure she was all right. But she wasn't mine. No.
She'd sometimes say she wished she'd never set eyes on me, or she wished I'd never been born. And it was, you know, these things cut deep, and I used to brood on them and be very, very hurt. And she didn't say that sort of thing to the other kids.
One day, when she was about 10, Val tried to tell her mother how she felt.
I'd said to her, you know, if ever there was a fire in this house, you'd save all the others before you save me. And it was something that I just instinctively felt. And this brought her up with a jolt, because she realized it was probably true.
Fred and Blanche Rylett, the other parents in the mix-up, had always refused to consider that the children could have been swapped But as their daughter Peggy grew older, her likeness to Margaret became unmistakable. Margaret wrote to Shaw, telling him she wanted to swap the girls back.
Val is a lovely little girl, but the truth is, there are times when I can't bear the sight of her.
To her dismay, Shaw advised her to leave the girls where they were.
They are not packets of sweets to be labelled with certain addresses and delivered there by the errand boy.
Margaret's last hope was to convince Charles that Val was not their daughter. So she took him on a 200-mile journey to Peggy's school playground in Nottingham to see if he could spot his real child.
We stood looking through the railings as the children all came out into the yard, a great rushing mass of them. And Charles said, "It isn't any one of those." Then practically at the end, Peggy came out, thrusting her arm into her coat, and stood there, and Charles said, "That's her. It couldn't possibly be anybody else."
Margaret wanted her husband's support so she could finally get her real daughter back, but she was to be disappointed. For once, Charles was in agreement with George Bernard Shaw.
Charles seemed to think that the uprooting would prove too traumatic, and they decided to leave it, and I went with it.
Was a golden age. The country was beginning to shake off the austerity of the war years. There was a new sense of hope. The Festival of Britain showcased the country's latest goods and designs. Protected from foreign competition, industry was booming. Joyce's husband Arthur applied for a full-time job at the Players' Cigarette Factory in Nottingham.
We had a letter to say that he'd actually got the job, and it was absolutely marvellous. It meant regular wage coming out every week. For once in our married life, we were on the feet, as you might say. Yes, it was lovely.
As Britain's economy brightened up, so did its homes. The fashion was bold patterns and bright colours, and there was no end to the novel features on offer. Joyce and Arthur had rather simpler tastes. After 20 years of marriage, they finally had enough money to buy a sofa.
He said, "Get your bib and tucker on." He says, "We're off out. I'm going to let you find something for the front room." I said, "What?" He says, "Oh, furniture, of course." So off we went down Mansfield Road, looking in all the shops, and we came to one lovely three-piece suite. We took both our eyes, and we went in and we were allowed to sit on it, try it and everything. So that was it. And we felt as though we could ask even the Queen in, because we'd got somewhere for her to sit.
Joyce's older sister, Margaret, often travelled down from Cumberland to Nottingham, but it wasn't to see Joyce. Peggy, the little girl Margaret believed was hers, was being brought up just streets away. Over the years, Margaret had made sure she became firm friends with Peggy's mother, Blanche, and the two families would often meet up. Peggy and Val played together, unaware they were living each other's lives. But Peggy didn't always enjoy these visits from Margaret.
Peggy resented me, I think, and the effect I had on the family she was with.
There always seemed to be a sort of slight atmosphere. I felt that she was causing trouble of some sort, although I didn't know why.
Once she said outright to me, "Why do you come here? My mother always cries when you've been."
Margaret was unhappy over the way Peggy's father, Fred, was bringing her up.
He held Peggy down, held her back, so that gave her the idea that anything she wanted to do was she couldn't really do, because she was not a man. I'd have slunged him if it didn't mind.
Fred was very traditional. He wouldn't let me have a fringe. He wouldn't let me wear blue for some strange reason. And he would sort of talk over me. He would talk to Blanche and say, she looks a mess. And it did sap my confidence a lot.
Despite her promise to everyone not to tell the girls the truth, Margaret was finding it increasingly hard to keep things to herself.
I thought if it had been me in the same situation, I'd want to know my own folk. However fond I was of the folk I was brought up with, I would want to know who I really belonged to. I never gave up my resolve that the girls should eventually know who their real people were.
In 1950, Margaret's mind was taken off the dilemma of the mixed daughters when she gave birth to a new baby girl at the age of 42.
Penny was a lovely baby when she was born. She was a pretty kid, quite a pretty kid. She's got deep dimples and practically no trouble.
I used to enjoy pushing Penny around in a pram. I felt quite proud of her and became almost like a second mum to her.
I've got film of her drinking and playing with her toys and so on. She's perfectly normal then. And it was after that that the head banging and screaming started. It was an awful time then.
Her features began to change and she began to grimace a lot and have a lot of uncontrolled movements, sort of twisting her hands in an awkward way.
Tragedy had struck Margaret's family once more. The doctors suggested Penny's condition may have been caused by encephalitis, but there was never a firm diagnosis.
Penny never developed language, she never developed speech. We could communicate more easily with the dog than with your own sister.
Penny took attention from us, and deep down I think we did resent her. We all pushed Mum to have her put into a home.
In the 1950s, doctors encouraged parents to put badly disabled children into care. Some were abandoned for life. But Margaret refused to commit Penny to an institution and kept her at home.
It was very exhausting for me, having to hold her even, because she threw herself about. That's, I don't like to think of that time.
By now, Margaret and her sister Joyce were living very different lives. But their children were about to face the same dreaded ordeal, the 11+.
Pay attention a moment, everyone, please. You should all have finished part 1 by now. I want you to turn straight over. Whether you finish part 1 or not, start part 2.
This new exam was designed to give the brightest children, whatever their background, the chance of a grammar school education, setting them up for life. But 80% failed. They went to the secondary moderns, where most pupils never took an exam again. Everything was riding on one test.
I had friends who said, if I don't get through, I'll commit suicide. I had a friend who said, if I don't get through, I'll just go down, walk off the end of the pier. It wasn't a nice future to contemplate. What happened to you if you didn't go to the grammar school? That you had no future. That was it. You were finished. You were scum.
Margaret expected her children to follow in her footsteps and go to grammar schools. Martin and Val sailed through the exam. Next up was Denise.
I panicked. I don't even think the questions registered. I really don't. And it was awful having the results read out in class, because I was one of the top of the class and all my friends passed and I didn't. So I felt stupid. I felt thick and non-intelligent, very unhappy, because I thought I would like to go to the grammar school like the others, and I knew I wasn't going.
Over in Nottingham, Joyce didn't expect any of her children to pass the 11 plus, but Richard was turning out to be a bright child.
When the results came out, it passed, and believe me, I think we did hit the roof.
It was like a beam of light, you know, going across my mum's face, that she'd actually got one of her sons that had achieved a position of going to high payment grammar school.
If you've got a child at a grammar school, you seem to fit in somewhere. And this is how we felt. It was, well, we were very proud, because my elder sister, Margaret, was a scholar there, and made me feel as though we fit in with the rest of the family, you see.
But coping with the demands of a grammar school was not easy for a poor family. Pupils were expected to be well turned out. It was a costly business.
My mum managed to kit me out in the initial uniform, but then when you actually got into the school, you found out that you needed gym equipment, sports equipment. It wasn't just uniform, it was a satchel full of requirements.
Meanwhile, middle-class Denise was starting out at her local secondary modern.
I hated it for the first year. People used to tease me because I suppose they thought I was a posh kid. So I suppose I tried to play that down and be one of them.
Her language changed, her behaviour changed, her whole social attitude changed. Common. She went common.
Only 1 in 22,000 secondary modern pupils ever made it to university. Children like Denise were being groomed for the less demanding jobs in life.
And what are you going to do, Wendy?
Hairdressing.
Are you hairdressing?
Yes, sir.
Because you want something neat and tidy and something to do with your hands?
Yes, sir.
I've lost heart. I suppose I envisaged myself ending up working in a factory or Woolworths or something. I couldn't think of anything else that would happen to me.
Like many middle-class children, Denise was saved by her parents, who took her out of the secondary modern and sent her to a private school.
It was a very gracious place to be, and I was over the moon that I was going there. So of course I showed off like mad then to all my second. I ain't going to a school that's got a swimming pool in the garden, and oh, I was horrible, toffee nose.
But while Denise was swanning it at her private school, her cousin Richard was finding it hard being the poor kid at the grammar.
He had to mix with various types, and there were quite a few that rather inclined to look down on one that had done well, that had come from a poorer class type of family.
The pressure there was, you know, people thinking, well, he must come from a right background, wearing clothes like that. And I just felt that I didn't want that to continue.
At the age of 15, Richard announced he was leaving school with no qualifications.
They were very disappointed, the teachers were. They couldn't really believe it when I went and told them.
It's something you don't like to look back on. We did our hardest to talk him into staying, the type of position it would lead to. It's wasted. That's what I thought it was. Wasted time and the opportunities.
For the adult world, a bigger crisis beckoned. The Cold War was hotting up and the nuclear arms race was escalating. There was now a real fear that Britain could soon be facing nuclear war. The government produced films to show what the grisly consequences would be.
There will inevitably be a great number of dead and dying in these areas, and those that escape with their lives will be subject to the additional hazard of fallout.
Householders were advised to prepare their homes against radiation. Margaret decided to take action.
It was while we were bothered about all this nuclear missile business. I thought it would be a good idea to try out what we might have to do if things got really serious.
One day I brought some friends back home. Unfortunately, I was very embarrassed to find that Mum was right in the middle of pretending that there was a nuclear war on.
I laid in stocks of food and so on, and we'd got to survive. Yes, that was fun.
We had to live out of tins and bottled water, and there was no way that Mum was going to cook anything.
Just one of my loony ideas, as usual. Anyway, I think we gave up before the end of the fortnight. We got fed up.
But there was one member of Margaret's family who didn't join in the fun. At the age of 16, Val discovered a large bundle of old letters.
It was marked the Peggy-Valerie affair. And I saw some references to weights, birth weights and things like this. And I was just so darn scared that, I just went hot and cold all over. And I couldn't fathom it out at the time. But I knew there was something to do with Peggy Violet and me that, was causing concern.
Val must have been going to the drawer where Mum kept the letters and had been reading them secretly for a while, but just not said anything.
Deep down, I think after I'd seen these letters, deep down I must have known. But probably didn't want to admit it. Because I wanted to belong somewhere.
But Margaret's thoughts were with another of her daughters. Her disabled child Penny was taken to hospital suffering from pneumonia. In the ward, Margaret overheard a conversation.
One of the doctors said, we'd better let her go, hadn't we? And the other one said, yes, she's not got much of a life.
In Mum's opinion, she was allowed to die because they didn't give her the medicine that she needed, because they could see that she was going to be a tremendous drain on Mum and Dad.
So they didn't try to save Penny, my handicapped little daughter, and I held it against them always. I was absolutely devastated.